Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jackie King, and I'd like to welcome everyone, audience members and viewers, to Diversity Matters LLC Confab Series. Today's topic impacts users across all demographics and in global reach. Through a comprehensive presentation and robust panel discussion with industry experts, today we will explore the realities of digital hate. Hate has always existed in many forms, in speech, writing, movies, and other mediums. Since the inception of the internet, however, extremist groups, foreign and domestic, have worked to leverage digital mediums as a means to promote their hate-filled messages and engage in potential recruiting of citizens. As technology platforms continue to evolve, so does the need to expand our current understanding on digital hate methods and strategies. It is only through this expanded knowledge base that we can more effectively combat the progress of these extremist groups and the ill intent of spreading hate across the globe. We must ask ourselves, where does protected hate end and evolve into provocative recruitment of enemy camps pitted against civilization? As senior learning consultant with Diversity Matters LLC, with 30-year career in policing, much of that spent training police recruits and sworn officers on issues of diversity and inclusion. I have seen hate evolve from tales of crosses burning on lawns, being driven underground, and then emerging again as graffiti written on walls, to hate groups posted on social media, recruitment of radicals, and even killing of members of society driven by this hate. Today's panel discussion on digital hate will reveal tools that will aid you, our viewers, and members of the audience with tools to identify and eradicate the rise of the latest form of hate. I can assure you that what you learn today will prove to be an eye-opening experience. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce co-founder of Diversity Matters LLC, Neil Simmel. Just a few words about Neil. We started training together probably 20 years ago, and as a young trainer, I learned so much from him. We bounced things off of each other, and I learned so much from him as far as my ability to get into this subject matter, and hopefully he learned a thing or two also. He has dedicated his life to advancing diversity, inclusion, and equity throughout his career in the government sector. Through Diversity Matters LLC, he is taking his broad experience and unique approach to more organizations and impacting change from within. Neil, take the podium.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for your kind words, Jackie. I certainly have learned plenty from you and the team. Very happy to be here. I'm very excited to be able to introduce our speaker today. I've had the pleasure of knowing and working for quite a few years now, and really honored to have him back in our community. Rick Eaton is one of the lead learning consultants for Diversity Matters, but his real role is working for the Simon Wiesenthal Center and Museum of Tolerance. Rick's responsibilities include research on terrorism and domestic extremism, as well as extremist groups worldwide. In addition to working for this great city of Columbus, some of the communities Rick has worked with, and there's too many to list, but include California Police and Highway Patrol, the Michigan State Police, the FBI, Miami-Dade Police, U.S. Attorney's Office, National Institutes Against Hate Crime, and the Texas Association of Hostage Negotiations, as well as the New Mexico Gang Task Force. It's my great pleasure to introduce Rick Eaton.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Diversity Matters, for having me today. I'm going to talk about the subject of digital hate, and I'd like to like to frame the issue so that we can talk about it for the panel. When I started in the field of extremism back 32 years ago, this was what I was doing, was looking at hard copy publications like this, looking at the Ku Klux Klan and other extremist groups, because we didn't have digital communications. But not long after I started working in this field, we started looking at some of the newest technologies, and the first guy that had the idea to use digital communications was a guy by the name of Louis Beam. He had been a soldier in Vietnam, had come back, joined the Texas Emergency Reserve, a Klan group that was targeting Vietnamese fishermen down in the Gulf of Mexico, trying to destroy their boats, disrupt them, and hopefully get them to leave their area. He was associated also with Aryan Nations, a very prominent white supremacy group in Idaho. And he was generally a pretty good speaker as well. He started using digital communications on what we call BBSs long before we had even the World Wide Web, but had some of the other features of what we now know as the Internet. But the first white supremacy site online was Stormfront. And up until recently, it had been online continuously since 1995. Stormfront, you see their statement quite up front, white pride worldwide, and their mission statement basically said that Stormfront was a resource for those courageous men and women fighting to preserve their white Western culture, ideals, and freedom of speech and association, a forum for planning strategies and forming political and social groups to ensure victory. People that get involved with these movements are told they're in a battle to save their race and their culture and their children and their families. So Stormfront, and I'll explain in a little while why they're not online any longer, but this up until recently was a very huge forum. International forums and domestic, you had extremists literally from all over the world that joined Stormfront. They had, at last count, over 300,000 members, although many of those were not active at the time. They had over 12 million postings. So a very, very unique forum, very important not only for people like myself, but also for law enforcement, because they could use it to find out what was going on in their communities if some of this type of activity was online. So we started producing a report when the World Wide Web started up in 1995, and we've produced 19 reports called Digital Terrorism and Hate. And we've tracked from when we only had hate online, then we had terrorism, which basically did not come online until after 9/11, because many of the people that promote that kind of thing did not have internet access. And we actually give a report card to the social media companies now, since that's the major feature and what most people are using. And our grades, even since this spring at the report card you're looking at, will change, because things have changed quite a bit just in the last couple of months, and I'm going to try to explain why that is. Charlottesville was a very important situation for what currently goes on the internet, and it might not look that way, since this was a rally that took place, you know, over Confederate monuments and things like that, but it's had a very important effect, and let me try to explain why. For about 40 years or so, these four gentlemen here were kind of the face of the white supremacy movement. There were others, but these were some of the major names. Over the years, in my work, I've had to happen to meet three of the four that you see there. But William Pierce, a former physics professor, Richard Butler, a former engineer at Lockheed, ran Aryan Nations, Matt Hale, who's currently doing 40 years in federal prison, and Tom Metzger, who's ran White Aryan Resistance, who's now up near 80, both Pierce and Butler have passed on. And what happened when they left the scene is the white supremacy movement was rudderless for about 10 or 12 years. It's only with the new younger generation that came about that put together what happened at Charlotte and has very much affected the online situation, so at Charlottesville. They used, when they did this, they used very famous cartoons like this one from Benjamin Franklin, Join or Die, and what they did on the top image is they put some of their own logos and things onto the original. They had the torch marches, if you're familiar with, they were marching, calling "You will not replace us," "One people, one nation, end immigration," "Blood and soil," and "Jews will not replace us." You had a lot of different groups that were organized to come to Charlottesville, most of this behind the scenes and done online. But what was different was many of the logos that you saw. This was the National Socialist movement. Some 3 or 4 years ago, you noticed the shield with the swastika. In Charlottesville and some of the more recent rallies, they've changed that. They've dropped the swastika. They're trying to portray themselves as something different than they are. Same thing here with Vanguard America. James Alex Fields, who was the man who ran over Heather Heyer and killed her, marched right here from Ohio, marched with Vanguard America at Charlottesville. This is an advertisement for their website. Another one, you see bloodandsoil.org. Well, the reason that bloodandsoil.org, Stormfront, and another one, Daily Stormer, also out of Ohio, are no longer online is because internet providers after Charlottesville decided that maybe they did not want these sites to be as offensive as they were and leave them online. This was started by one who published a particularly disgusting article about the dead woman Heather Heyer, which had no basis in truth, and that site, Daily Stormer, was the first one to go off, but others have now lost their access to the internet. So Charlottesville has had a major effect. Traditionalist Workers' Party, another one of these so-called alt-right groups, is still online. The Shield Wall Network, which is trying to bring together some of these different groups, is online. I'm going to skip that one. But what we also saw just recently, a new site came on called the Nationalist Front. And what this is an attempt by some of the groups that organized the Charlottesville rally to bring unity to the white supremacy movement and using the online platform. So you have Matthew Heimbach from the Traditionalist Workers' Party. You have Jeff Scoop, who's from the National Socialist movement, and Dylan Irizarry from Vanguard America, and Dr. Michael Hill from a group called League of the South. These four have put together this site. All four of those are groups that were in Charlottesville, and now they're trying to use the internet to unify these various groups, something that has been tried over the years, not been all that successful, so we'll have to see. And they talk about how they're going to about doing it, and so on. So who are these groups, the alt-right? Well, the term the alt-right was coined by a guy by the name of Richard Spencer. He runs a site called the National Policy Institute. And Spencer is not uneducated. He has a BA and an MA. He, if you read the text there, he says that this is a independent organization dedicated to the heritage, identity, and future of people of European descent in the United States. So if you read closely, you see that it's still a white supremacy organization. And it's very interesting because he promotes the fact that he's been written up by the New York Times and NPR and the Washington Post and the Chicago Tribune and other sources. That's who he's been reported on by. And then he says, and he's a frequent commentator on RT International, a Russian site, RT, that was one of those that heavily promotes false news. But the alt-right runs the gamut from guys in suits and ties to outright neo-Nazis. The American Freedom Party is one of the more older traditional type groups, an anti-immigration group, but it's run by this guy William Daniel Johnson that you see up at the top there. He's got a couple of former professors, and Paul Fromm, a professor from Toronto, and Kevin Macdonald, who was a professor until recently at Cal State Long Beach in California, who promotes a theory that Jews use a superior intelligence as a weapon against others to outcompete them for resources. Daniel Johnson has been associated with many white supremacy movements over the years. I met him when he was promoting something 30 years called the Pace Amendment that said that only white Northern European Aryans could be citizens. And other minorities could stay and work, but they couldn't own property or vote. And Jews would all have to leave. Talked about Kevin Macdonald. So as I said, the alt-right runs the gamut from guys in suits and ties to outright Nazis like Andrew Anglin, who's from right here in Ohio, runs this site called the Daily Stormer. And this is one of the site that published the really offensive piece about Heather Heyer and was taken offline the next day. Obviously, he's a Harry Potter fan because he's photoshopped J.K. Rowling into an SS Nazi uniform, and he's also doing a Sig Heil here. Now, anybody that knows anything about Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling knows that it's totally opposite of anything that they would ever promote. But that's the type of thing that we see. Anglin was the first one to embrace candidate Trump, calling him the glorious leader. But he published this alt-right FAQ, and it's very important, the frequently asked questions, because in this it kind of talks about who these different alt-right groups are, gives their websites, and it's a very interesting collection. He also puts a question and answers up there where he says that, you know, is this just repackaged white supremacy or Nazism? Yes, it is, even though in Charlottesville they tried to present themselves as, quote, nationalists and not Nazis. Other groups such as Blood and Soil I mentioned, this is another group that has lost their access to the web. But this guide to alt-right talks about the different factions that make up the alt-right. And many people are familiar with Alex Jones. He's a conspiracy theorist that runs a website called InfoWars, and among other things believes that the Sandy Hook shooting was actually a hoax and the government had something to do with perpetrating it. They've got libertarians and paleo-conservatives on there. They've got the traditionalist white nationalist movement. They have identitarian movements, which is a platform that came from Europe, young people in Europe. And they've got the troll culture. Well, this is the people that went online, especially during the campaign during 2016, and unmercifully attacked anyone that they felt was unfair to then candidate Trump. They have a variety of different sites that they use, 4chan, 8chan, Reddit, sites that have very few rules and allow personal attacks. They had something called the manosphere, which they cite. Now, when I originally looked at this, I didn't really take it that seriously, but then I looked at the websites which they attribute to the manosphere, and besides the fact that they are certainly anti-feminist and very male-dominated, the sites are racist and white supremacist as well. And then there's also the gamer culture, which has been a big recruiting area of young people that play a lot of games and are recruited through these online games. So it's a pretty wide-ranging group that they claim are part of the alt-right. I'm going to skip this here. I was asked to speak at a meeting about the week before Charlottesville talking about, it was a local group that was talking about white privilege, and it was a mixed race group that just wanted to discuss this subject and find out, was there white privilege? If so, what was it? And the like. Well, this local group in Southern California found out about this meeting online and decided to show up and protest it. So about 25 people showed up and were outside the meeting chanting anti-white and things like that. But what was most interesting is they posted a Facebook page with all their pictures on it. And if you take a close look at this, you see that this is very unusual for people that are involved with something that appears to be a white supremacy group. You've got people with the names of Rodriguez and Hinojosa and other Hispanic names. A lot of young people that got caught up in this kind of troll culture during the campaign. And what's interesting, about 3 or 4 people in this picture were for sure at the Charlottesville a week later. But now I think that was a high watermark, because what's happened is a lot of these people who saw what happened at Charlottesville, they may have been online warriors, but when it came to actually seeing what happened at Charlottesville with the violence, with the death of Heather Heyer, many of them have apparently, by their Facebook pages and others, backed out of some of these things. This guy here is a guy by the name of Baked Alaska, who was one of those at Charlottesville as well. This is some examples of how people were attacked online during the campaign. This woman is a journalist with The Guardian, published something that was uncomplimentary to then candidate Trump, was viciously attacked with anti-Semitic slurs and statements, Jews to ashes, referencing the Holocaust. This was very common, especially with journalists during the campaign last year. Just some additional examples. But this one in particular, Emmy Rossum is the actress who was in the movie version of Phantom of the Opera. Posted something exactly right after the campaign, after the election in last November, and in return she got this image and this posting on Twitter saying, this is in all your ilk's future. You will be seeing a train shortly. Hollywood days of subjugation are over. Sig Heil. Seeing a train means that you will be taken to Auschwitz, and that's actually a drawing of the gates of Auschwitz with Trump signs on the sides of it. So this kind of vicious targeting went on and still continues to go on today. Also, the alt-right has developed a alternative universe online called Kekistan, and it sounds rather bizarre, but it's a very major thing. They've got hashtags, Free Kekistan, and they actually credit this to what they call a meme war, which was the alt-right versus everyone else during the campaign last year. But it sounds like it's a very bizarre thing, but they have merchandise, they have a lot of people that use the hashtag Free Kekistan, and you almost have to go on and look at what they're doing, but it's got thousands of people that have joined in on this online. What's happened is a lot of these people who were viciously targeting people during the campaign found that they were being taken off sites like Twitter. So what happened was that they started using alternative sites. One of those very popular is one called Gab. A guy by the name of Ricky Vaughn, and if that name sounds familiar, Ricky Vaughn was the Charlie Sheen character in Major League. He's anonymously using this. He moved to Gab, and many of the others went along with him. And other sites on Gab, they started using additional sites like 8chan I mentioned earlier. They started using a site called Vote, another one which they could use not only anonymously, but had very few rules, and one called Discuss as well. But I wanted to focus on Gab for a minute, because Gab was only created in August 2016. It was actually founder Andrew Torba is associated himself with the alt-right, so it was easy for him to give a platform to those that were moving away from more traditional sites online. and he was a software developer that actually was banned from a group of software developers because of his attitude and so forth. So he started Gab. He was removed from this Y Combinator, this collaborators group. And he claims his frog logo actually comes from the Bible. On an earlier slide, you saw an image of Pepe the Frog, which is the kind of mascot of the alt-right. It wasn't initially an alt-right symbol, but the alt-right kind of appropriated it. And Gab also on their postings has this frog, but he says it's from a different source. Gab is interesting because this is from this past summer. It was ranked 26,000 in the world, and yet 8,500 here in the U.S. Just yesterday, it's ranked 26,000 in the world, but it's gone up to 6,900 in the U.S., which is a pretty good jump in about a 2 to 3 month span. Actually down to 5,000 now. So some of the other alternative sites that I mentioned, Gab, 8chan, Vote, Discuss, and some that most people have never heard of, Sea Lion Club, Free Speech, and Jab In. These are all places that the alt-right has started moving to. In more traditional hate anti-Semitism, we see things like this from Facebook, calling the holy hoax or the Holocaust was a hoax, using very, very disturbing characters meant to mimic Jews and others. This image here of the hook-nosed Jew is one of the most popular images you'll find on Facebook, something that they're starting to look rather closely at in images in general, and we have a new technology where they can start looking at images, similar images across their platform and start to deal with them. This is actually our dean and founder, Rabbi Heyer, who was giving a invocation at the inauguration in January. And while he was still speaking, this image was posted to Twitter. The same image used to represent a Jew superimposed on him, literally while he was still giving his invocation. We have so many hate sites online, particularly many of them targeting religion. This one, Burn a Quran. We have Holocaust denial is very prominent online. Holocaust Hoax Museum was a Facebook page. Real Nazi Death Camps. This was a bogus video on YouTube claiming that the camp that the Nazis used to show people that the Holocaust really wasn't as bad as it was, Theresienstadt was used, and then after the cameras came in and filmed all these people, then they were sent off to Auschwitz to be killed. Other anti-Semitic sites, this one's in Japanese. I mean, there's literally thousands and thousands of these. A lot of conspiracy sites claiming Israel and Jews were responsible for 9/11. And conspiracy theories and so forth that Jews run the world. There's so much false flag ideas that Jews are responsible for just about everything. Zionism was responsible for the Air Asia disaster even before anybody knew what happened, but these things come out. No matter what the incident, something comes out and says it didn't really happen the way that you think it did. Even with the shooting in Las Vegas this weekend, within hours there was a site online claiming that the shooter was actually a flaming leftist and associated with leftist political causes. And before nobody still knows what his motivation was in Las Vegas, but yet there's a lot of material out from these conspiracy sites claiming that he was one thing or another. On the field of terrorism, whenever there's a terrorist incident, we see social networking postings, this one from Instagram, encouraging others to go out and commit stabbing acts like have been done in London and Paris and other cities. This is one that came out after the first bridge attack last spring, and when you translate it, it basically says, well, this is the results of the Caliphate army, the people that want to reestablish the Caliphate, the worldwide Islamic government, and how many victims there were from running over, etc. One of the other things that we find in the field of terrorism is online magazines, things that are used to inspire others. The idea of using trucks, as we've seen in recent terrorist attacks, came from a publication called the Lone Mujahid Pocketbook, which also contained other recipes for bombs and things like that. It came out about a month before the Boston Marathon bombing, and it contained the same pressure cooker bomb that was used by the Tsarnaev brothers in the Boston Marathon bombing. It gives other homemade recipes, things that you can find in your kitchen to make explosives and other devices. This is an English language ISIS publication, used to be called Dabiq, now called Rumiyah or Rome, based on the legendary battle that Islam claims was going to be the final battle between Islam and Rome, or the West. This is a new English language bulletin, just a short one-page thing that has come out just in the last couple months, and they put out these, have inspirational quotes, and in this case it's one saying, you know, you need to live up to your obligations. It's the obligation of a good Muslim to go out and commit some attack and fight our, quote, enemies. Little inspirational things, one page at a time. Dabiq, and they regularly do this where, for example, when the Jordanian pilot was captured and eventually burned by ISIS, they released that video. Literally a week later, they had a new issue of Dabiq out talking about this and going over it, giving justifications for why they committed that act. Another one from Al-Shabaab Mujahideen in Somalia after the Westgate Mall attack there. All these publications in English, although there are other languages as well. ISIS report what it's like inside the, quote, Islamic State, all in English. There's also Russian publications, Turkish publications, German publications, trying to reach Muslims anywhere that they can, trying to inspire them to commit other attacks. Inspire magazine, published by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, all in English. They were the ones who put out the Lone Mujahid Pocketbook as well. Resurgence, an Al-Qaeda magazine in English, featuring Adam Gadon, a Southern California native who we have since taken out by a drone, and one from East Africa where they're putting out things, again, in English, trying to recruit people to join. There's another issue of Rumiyah, or Rome, and then all of these magazines will contain ways to communicate with us, how to reach us, and so forth. YouTube is a big source of this type of material. YouTube is getting much better. I just had a meeting with them a couple of weeks ago, and they are really starting to get the message that they are part of the problem. And things like this, although there's a lot of it out there, they're getting better about at least looking at what's on their system and trying to deal with them. These are just a few examples that I showed them. Anwar al-Awlaki, who has inspired the shoe bomber, inspired the underwear bomber, was taken out years ago by a drone attack, yet you find his videos still on YouTube. And it just goes on and on with not only terrorist videos, but things that are anti-Islamic, such as this one, Imagine There's No Islam, set to the John Lennon song Imagine. Explosives, how-to, they're getting better about some of that material. There used to be a lot of things that are now starting to take off, the homemade explosives type things. And lastly, I want to talk about encryption, because one of the things that we see a lot of is encrypted apps are coming out. They're the same apps that your kids use for communications with their friends and the like, but there's one called SureSpot. It's heavily encrypted. They even advertise that they don't save your password, so if you lose your password, you're out of luck. Well, this was a posting from Twitter where a guy using the name Al-Awlaki, that same guy who inspired other terrorists, says, well, if I get blocked, message me on Kik or SureSpot. So at the time I saw this and I said, well, he's offering, I had not even heard of SureSpot at the time I caught this. So I said, okay, I'll download SureSpot onto my iPad. Within 5 minutes, I was communicating with a ISIS soldier in Syria. I had a 15-minute conversation with this guy talking about what it's like there, and gee, I didn't know you had good internet access. Oh yeah, we have internet cafes everywhere, and so forth. So if a Jewish guy sitting in an office in Los Angeles can reach a terrorist in Syria in the space of 5 minutes, how about somebody, a young kid who is a Muslim who thinks that it's his duty to join up with the Islamic State? And it's all encrypted where unless you have that phone, you're not going to find out what went on. And they even say they do not keep these messages on their server. So there are plenty of these messaging apps. This is only a small number of them. WhatsApp used to be big with the kids. Now Snapchat is, Kik, SureSpot. Telegram is one that we find. Telegram is both a one-to-one communication messenger, but also you can have a feed. So on the left side you see contacts there. On the right side you see whatever it is. Nasher was an ISIS feed in English, and they had half a dozen, and they had 10 others in different languages. That one's been taken off, but there's others that come up. And this last thing I want to show you is this was a Telegram feed, all of it in Arabic, but you see in the middle there it says Tutanota. So I wanted to find out what was this guy promoting at this site, Tutanota. Well, it turns out that Tutanota is an encrypted app where you can set it up so you can get your email through the encrypted app. And again, unless you have that specific device that it's going to or from, nobody, government or anybody else, can get any access to it at all. We put all this material into an app and a website called Digital Terrorism and Hate. I mentioned it earlier. This is what it looks like. It's got 3 major categories. Each of those have a couple of different levels of subcategories and then individual entries. And it can be accessed through digitalhate.net. We try to update it on a regular basis, put in new information, because now we try to encapsulate what goes on the internet. There's over 700 entries just on this in these different categories about what the new trends and things like that are, but it's changing literally every day. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I guess we'll proceed to the panel discussion. Yeah, sure.
I have a question.
Okay. Question.
Fascinating topic. Back to when you were talking about the alt-right.
Gotcha.
Obviously those people walk among us, they live among us, they work with us. So do they, when they're not on Facebook or not on social media, do they identify themselves, or how do we know that we're dealing with those people?
In a lot of cases, you would not notice whatsoever, because one of the things they're doing, as you saw with Charlottesville, rather than have swastika armbands and things like that, you know, they're kind of wearing the khakis and the white 3-button shirts and so forth. Less of them are getting tattoos, which might be obvious if they've got Celtic cross tattoos or other things. unless they're giving you an indication by their actions, and many of them won't. They won't do those things because you know, they don't want to do their business where they eat. So you wouldn't necessarily know. Some of you might. Obviously, some of the older, long-term ones, the skinheads that got a lot of tattoos and have them on their face and chest and all these things. But in many cases, unless you're able to kind of decipher what's coming out of their mouth, if they're spouting anything, then you might not know. And that is kind of an orchestrated thing these days. Well, let's make ourselves into something that we haven't been. Let's not be as obvious. Let's blend into the community. I'll give you an example. There's a guy who used to be the leader of the Southern California skinheads, a guy by the name of Ashley Brown. Ashley Brown went to law school, became a corporate attorney. His arms are fully sleeved on both sides with tattoos. Unless he takes off his shirt, you're never going to know that he was a white supremacist. So no, there is a concentrated effort these days to look different than they really are. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Rick, in terms of, this was very eye-opening for me, and in terms of the rapid enhancement of this, do you attribute it to social media, to the change in the administrations, a combination of everything? It just seems like it's happening faster and faster and more.
This was going on long before the new administration. I'm not going to give them credit for this. Social media has had an immense amount to do with it. Basically, what's happened is 22 years ago, when the World Wide Web came along, there was a lot of the white supremacy groups had a lot of promise that we can put up sites and we can recruit people and the like. And it took a long time, but it wasn't really until social media that promise really came to fruition. And what's happening now is there's always somebody. Right now, as we speak, there's two guys sitting in a Starbucks in San Francisco trying to come up with the best new platform or app or something else that they can get people to sign up for, that is different, that can get attention, that they can get subscribers, and eventually make, you know, $20 million or more on. And the more this goes, there's more people coming up with new platforms and things like that. So yes, in the last 2 to 3 years, as you say, the acceleration rate has been incredible. I attribute part of it to the fact that this has always been the case, but now so with social media. People that wouldn't say things to your face. Now, there are always a couple that will say things to your face, but people that wouldn't say things to your face love the sanctity of sitting behind their keyboard and spouting whatever comes to mind, and don't have any problem in doing so. And that's always been the case, but now it's easy with the original websites and things like that. You didn't have the interaction. Now you have the instantaneous communication. I know I can respond to what you said, and I know 3 minutes later or less, I'm going to have your response and be right back at it. It's almost like a drug in some cases. So yes, but the pace has been wildly increased in recent years for sure, and I think that in some respects social media is getting a handle on it. Certainly on terrorism, they've gotten much better. Twitter made a big show of saying, you know, we dropped 350,000 terrorist accounts over an 18-month period. The fact that they allowed those there in the first place was a problem, but they're getting better at it. They're getting digital ways that they can locate this stuff. Even when things are posted, a new magazine and things like that, a lot of times that account is literally down the next day. So in one respect, they're getting better at it, but in another, it's growing quickly. Yes?
So, what's the lure, what's the attraction that's drawing people to the sites? And then how easy is it for, say, a youth to stumble across one of these sites on the web?
Unfortunately, it's a lot easier than you think. And I actually wanted to show you a couple more slides. I've almost forgot. I'm glad you brought it up. is it's actually very easy, and this has been going on for years. Kids even 20 years ago would search for alternative music. And what would they run up with? They would run up with skinhead bands and things like that that would come up in their search for alternative music. Now with social media, if you take a close look when you go on Twitter or Facebook, if you get onto one site, and I'll show you a couple, then it will suggest others for you to go to. So all you have to do is one little click in your mind. Oh, that's interesting. I'll click on that. And even if it, then it's going to give you a half a dozen others. So what we did is we created a class called Students' Tools for Tolerance. It's designed to talk to one class in a 45, 50-minute period. And the facilitator will go in and talk to kids about what their social media habits are. And we know what the answers are. Yeah, they don't use Facebook. They all have accounts, but they won't use it because their parents and grandparents are on it. They do use Instagram. They don't like WhatsApp. They do use Snapchat and so forth. So we talk to them about that. And then we ask, have you ever seen offensive material online? What do you do about it if you do? Do you know anything about hate and terrorism online? Has anybody ever approached you promoting those things? And then what we do is we break them up into 4 or 5 groups, depending on how big the class is. And each group gets one page from an offensive social media account. We don't give them organized groups like the Klan or neo-Nazis and stuff like that. But I'll just show you a couple examples. This is one on Twitter called Funny Racist Jokes. So it's pretty much an equal opportunity hate page. It's got black jokes, it's got blonde jokes, it's got Asian jokes, etc. We kind of look, you see if you're going to get some laughs out of that group that's got that. You expect that, so forth. Well, so each group gets a page. This is one where a couple of Instagram pages that promote Taylor Swift as the Aryan goddess. They photoshopped her into Nazi outfits and show her waving to the crowd that looks like Nazi salutes. So we take 5 groups. One of them will be, I think, one of them's there's Taylor Swift, there's the White Pride page, there's an anti-Muslim page. Each group gets one. We have them discuss it among themselves for a few minutes, and then what we do is we put each one on the screen and we have that group walk back. What did you think? What did you feel when you saw this stuff? Were you offended? Things like that. We talk about that. Then and if we have time, when we do the anti-Muslim one, we have a video of a girl, a young lady, their age, basically talking about how bad Muslims are, what their beliefs are bad, that they're all terrorists and so forth. What she doesn't know about Islam, you could make a book about. But and then after that, we talk about, well, hate has consequences. And we give some examples. Dylan Roof, who spent a lot of time online, ran a web page, put up a manifesto. What did Dylan Roof do? He shot 9 people at a church in South Carolina. Wade Michael Page spent a lot of time watching conspiracy videos. He was associated with a white supremacist band. What did he do? Opened fire in the Sikh temple, killing 6. And other examples. But to show them these things have consequences, because what I tell groups that I talk to is that people that get involved with these movements live, breathe, eat, and sleep that movement 24/7. And it's in their head all the time. So we talk about what the consequences are, and then the last section of this is what you can do. Well, the first thing you can do is take these offensive material and offensive social networking thing seriously. Too many kids, we ask them what they do. Well, we just ignore it or block it or whatever. You got to take it seriously. It's not something to be laughed at or ignored. We talked about consequences. All these platforms have reporting. Use the reporting features. Most kids will say they don't. Usually 1 or 2 in a group will say that they do use the reporting feature. And we created an app called Combat Hate, where if somebody doesn't want to report to the platform or sees something, sees a hate crime or a hate incident or something like that, they can report it to us. And it's an app that we created mainly for young people. It's a free app. It's anonymous, so they don't have to give any information. But they can use it to report offensive things, and at least they've done something about it. There aren't a lot of things that we can have them do beyond reporting to the platforms when they see it, but we want to give them a sense that there is something they can do. So again, it's all based on social media because that's what the kids are using, and the good portion of the traffic on the net. So,
traction around you being able to measure the success you're having with that, because one of my concerns would be some of these apps are encrypted, some are invitation only, so the parent never knows.
right, absolutely.
The child is looking at it because they don't have the invite to Snapchat or Instagram or whatever. So, is there any back doors that parents can do to sort of say, let me get into looking at what my child might be looking at?
Not unless they have a deal that you get a phone, I get access to it once a week. Same thing with a computer, because there's actually a couple apps out there that look like something very innocuous until you punch it, and then you find out it's something that you don't want your kids to have. There's actually a couple that were created specifically as masks. So you really have to make that contract with your kid when you give them a phone or a device that they can do that kind of thing on, so that you can find out. And let's face it, most parents don't look at what their kids are doing online. I mean, if some will make them have the computer in the kitchen or whatever, but the good majority don't, and that's a real problem. And there's only so much that we can do from the outside. That's a parental decision. So, with that, I guess maybe we'll get to the panel. Do you have a question?
I said that was a fascinating conversation. If we could just take 5 minutes, and then we'll return and pick up the panel, and I'm sure we'll have more great discussion. Thank you all. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're going to segue into our panel discussion on digital hate. I'd like to introduce to you our panelists. First, we have Mark Collins. Mark is a criminal defense attorney based out of Columbus. Mark has 25+ years career, including a wide variety of cases ranging from juvenile court to capital offenses. He has also represented police officers and teachers in union cases across the state of Ohio. Along with giving lectures on various criminal issues, Mark serves on the Board of Governors of the Columbus Bar Association and has served on their financial committees, as well as helped to instituted pilot programs targeting community involvement. Thank you and welcome, Mark.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Mr. Rick Eaton. He's the Senior Research for the Simon Wiesenthal Center Digital Terrorism and Hate Project. Rick provides a depth of insight into the ever-evolving use of digital methods as a means of amplifying hate. His expertise spans over 30 years and covers all subject areas related to terrorism, domestic extremism, and extremist groups. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Our next panelist is Neil Simmel. He's the co-founder and partner of Diversity Matters, LLC, with over 25 years of extensive knowledge and practice within the diversity and inclusion space. Neil specializes in community building, mediation, communication, and fostering positive culture change. Neil has dedicated his life to helping organizations realize their potential through diversity and inclusion. And I'd like to welcome all of our panel members. We just had a presentation given by Mr. Eaton, and I'd like to direct the first question to you, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
We talked earlier about these people who are involved in these hate groups, and that they're not easily identifiable outside of the social network platform. How do we identify those people? And also, do you see a return of institutional racism? I see these people are doctors, lawyers, they're college students, they're professionals. They're out here in the world amongst us. How do we identify who they are, and do you see that as a problem?
Let's not let's not jump to conclusions that we're going to institutional racism. There are individuals out there. I think that if we've come somewhere over the years, and it's not to say things are perfect, but if we've come somewhere, we've gotten better about these type of people within the business community, within the government community, things like that. It's not saying that they won't be there, but to think that those things are going to have a major effect on society or anything like that. These people are not that prominent. There are not as many of them. So I don't want to give the wrong impression that type of thing is going to happen. How to identify them is, as we discussed earlier, is difficult, because unless you have your antenna up and hear the buzzwords or things, and again, not only online taking things seriously, but take things seriously in the workplace as well. And sometimes people shy away from that type of thing, and there's concerns there. But especially in this new younger generation, it will be harder to identify these people. The guys and the people associated with those groups that I showed earlier were very open about what they were about. The skinheads had tattoos and were very open about it. And in most cases, when they got jobs, it was in industries that didn't care, in construction and things like that. In the corporate world, I think it's a matter, unless you, like I say, you hear those buzzwords, you hear it in their speech and so forth, it's going to be very difficult. But on the other hand, that's their right. As long as they're not affecting you in your daily job or the larger community, then they have every right to be and have the ugly beliefs that they do.
Okay, thank you. Any other panelists care to comment on that? You've mentioned that they have their right to say those words, so I'm going to go to you next, Mark. Okay. When does that rhetoric cross the line, and when does it become something that's your right to free speech or something that's prosecutable?
That's a great question, and it's a double-edged sword. I mean, the Constitution is a beautiful thing in that it gives wide latitude to hate speech. Over the past 100 years, there's been a couple cases that have carved out narrow exceptions that allow certain aspects to be said, and it comes up against the protections. And it evolved to what's called a fighting words doctrine. Mm-hmm. And it's a situation now where if you have specific intent, to create a threat and to provoke a certain unlawful response, that's basically where the situation is. So boiled down, the issue is the more specific it is and the more immediate it is, the more likely that it becomes criminal. The issue then becomes how to implement it, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, depending on if you're in the southern portion of Ohio versus the northern portion of Ohio. And that it works like that all over across the country, that there's so many different standards. So, as a defense attorney, and if I'm charged with the responsibility of representing someone who's, charged with a hate crime or charged with hate speech in federal court or state court, I'm cloaking, ourselves in the Constitution and free speech. And, so I see the effects, how it works there. But at the same time, I guess the most simple answer for you is the more specific and the more immediate the threat is, then the more likely it'll be considered criminal.
Okay, thank you. Neil, I'd like you to answer a question, please. Could you connect with us? You do a lot of training with diversity and inclusion. Could you give us maybe a connection between those programs and digital hate?
Absolutely. In addition to the training experience, I've had a lot of years of experience in enforcing civil rights code, and it never felt particularly satisfying to do so, to just be punitive in terms of trying to rectify a bad situation. Punishing a perpetrator doesn't do much to change the outcome in the future. So I think really as we see more exposure and utilization of digital media to espouse these hate and discriminatory kinds of practices, you know, I think the reasonable counter to it is further education, further training, utilizing the web for those intents, not leaving it only open to the hate spectrum. It's along the lines of you trying to foster compliance versus just punishing people who have perpetrated these acts. And a lot of it's couched now in the movement around restorative justice, that it's not just enough to punish, but how do we make both parties in a situation whole? Both the person who has been victimized, but also the victimizer. How do they get learning or change behaviors or adapt new ways of thinking that might help prevent them from getting into this kind of situation in the future?
Okay, Mark, could you expand on that as far as how do we go from not just bestowing a punitive damage on that person? You're a criminal defense attorney. How do we make the victim and the perpetrator whole in a situation like this?
I think that's one of the reasons we're here, but again, a great question. And in preparing for this and trying to get ready for today, these two people are leaders in their field. I mean, just giants, and it was pretty impressive to read. And then I was looking up the restorative justice, and you know, I deal with criminal justice every day, but I got to be honest, it's depressing on a day-to-day basis because I see the worst of the worst, and so I kind of work backwards. The best example I can give you is that when I see the result of restorative justice, and this is going to sound different, is in the most violent cases. When I have a death penalty case, or when I have a murder case, and when I have a victim's family in the courtroom, they've gone through the whole process, and I have a defendant's family in the courtroom together at sentencing, you see the compassion and the faith and the respect for the two families have for one another. And you see the forgiveness, and you see just the empathy that each side has, and I'm like, geez, how can we get that to the beginning? And then when you look at some of the things, I mean, I think some of the juvenile systems in the country, I know Minnesota has some good programs, Indiana has some good programs in restorative justice, and I think those programs start with, you know, hey, how do we make the victim and the whole, and how do we make this process whole? And I think it's in a situation, in a perfect world, I'd like to see the juvenile system and the programs that are being implanted into the prison systems, implanted into there where, you know, meaningful, thought-provoking ideas and concepts are dealt with the prisoners. Then people from the outside in the community are put in, both victims' families, prosecutors, all aspects of the criminal justice system, as well as, you know, law enforcement. And I think the law enforcement and the police officers, if they're involved in that process, that's one way to get there. But I mean, it's a difficult question to answer. I know the feeling that I have when I leave the courtroom and I see the result of those two families coming together and the respect and going back and forth. The object is now to get there.
Right. Yes, sir.
Yeah. As it pertains to the digital world, I think that we're in a relative infancy as it comes to legal issues. I mean, we're only talking about having the World Wide Web for 22 years. So in this regard, laws are still evolving, and we've seen some laws come out, such as some cases come across, such as the bullying cases that have then led to young people taking their own lives and things like that. And I think that these things will evolve further as it pertains to digital anyway. It doesn't mean that we're going to lose our First Amendment rights or anything like that, but there are limits to free speech. The classic, you know, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater and start a riot. You know, something where people are trampled. The other thing in regards to just in general, especially with young people, I would compare what goes on in the real world to what I mentioned earlier about people that got out from behind their keyboards and went to rallies like Charlottesville and maybe weren't ready for that. Young people that get involved in hate incidents or hate crimes, when they hit the justice system, it's like that they were in this bubble and all of a sudden that bubble bursts, and a good majority at that time realized, you know, maybe I was in something I shouldn't have been. Not all, but some as well. So if we're lucky, more people will get that wake-up call.
Great. Great answer.
If I may follow up on, Rick touched upon an important thing, I think, that from my perspective, the infancy of the laws. And it's not only just the infancy of the laws with the digital situation, it's law enforcement's ability to go get that information. I just attended a seminar with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and it was people from all around the country, and the lead person who gathers the information and does the search warrants for the FBI and the Department of Justice and everything, they can't get to Snapchat. They can't get to some of these things. And then from a defense side, if they can't get to it, then I can't get to it to help my case as well. So as Rick said, it's so new, and the technology is evolving so fast that it's very, very difficult to go after the hate crime type situations in the digital world, because the law enforcement can't even go get it.
Right.
I think, too, it also opens up kind of a window to look at some remedies that may be outside of the court system, traditional court system. One of the focuses for me on pursuing mediation as a practice was just that. Very often, particularly in the jurisdiction I worked in, it was a criminal code. So it was very difficult to meet that burden of proof in a discrimination case, which didn't mean there wasn't any remedies available. It just meant that wasn't the only path. And we would often, sit the parties down with a neutral to just say what would make it right. And surprisingly, very seldom did the victim say, I want them to go to jail. That wasn't on their mind as much as training, learning, apologies, having them understand what the victimization did. Those kinds of topics came up a lot more. So I do think that we need to consider other options for healing and remedy outside of just traditional legal settings.
Right. That was my next question. Between just reporting that person and blocking them on social media and actually criminally charging them with an offense, what things are in the middle where we can actually get them to realize that there's some harm done. It doesn't rise to the level of criminality, but it also should be taken more seriously than just blocking you or reporting you. Does anyone else want to respond to that while we're on that topic?
Just that in a very general sense, it's very often someone victimizing a person or a community they've had no contact or very little knowledge of. So just by increasing that exposure, increasing that knowledge, I think it may start to rectify some of the problem.
Okay, thank
and
you.
It's hard to recommend things, but we see on a regular basis cases where individuals have opened a dialogue with someone who's diametrically opposed to them, who may literally hate them. I'm not saying that this is going to work all the time, but it has. We do see cases like this, that somebody really needed just somebody to communicate with them, to that can't believe that a Jewish person or a Muslim person would have even talked to them. So it can be done. I'm not saying that everybody should go out and try to embrace a white nationalist online and see if they can change their views.
Right.
But it is something to think about. Because, as I say, people that are in this bubble, that have been recruited to these movements, that are in the moment, and they're attending meetings and hanging out with people, and if they find out there are other things out there and other people out there, maybe they might change.
That's a great point. And also, when they're, like you said earlier, when they're actually taken offline and put into that situation in the real world in real time, and they're actually facing some criminal action, then maybe that opens their eyes a little bit also. Rick, I'd like to ask you, in your research on this digital hate, what type of digital hate have you seen an increase in most recently?
Oh, that's really tough. I see so much of it. It's hard sometimes. I always get a little flutter when I hear people say, well, what about the rise in anti-Semitism or the rise in anti-Muslim activity? The truth is that some of those things, there's not always a rise, because it's pretty constant anyway. And I think certainly in recent years, the push towards anti-Muslim activity, anti-Muslim websites, and name calling and things like that are really one of the top things that we see. But there's so many out there. As I say, the campaign last year brought so much hatred to the fore over the election, and that to some extent I'm seeing subside, although it's still out there.
Mm-hmm.
We aren't seeing as much of the confrontational issues that we saw last year. So certainly the anti-Muslim activity is one. Anti-Semitism is pretty consistent over the years, and other forms of racism are generally fairly steady.
Okay.
I think from a practical standpoint, from the criminal justice system,
Mm-hmm.
the biggest spike we see is in with the regards to the data is in the bullying. Teenagers bullying other teenagers, and I'm not sure if that's because the parents then get so involved and they make the most noise that those are the crimes that the local prosecutors are then going forward with. But that seems to be the most prevalent right now in terms of the court system. What you're seeing, and it's in as other parts of the country, it's deadly sometimes, and the bullying and the hate that goes back and forth between teenagers, and but that's usually what we see the most right now, or at least the last 2 years.
And be clear that a lot of these issues, as Mark will attest to, are based on your prosecutor or your district attorney or city attorney, whoever you're dealing with. It's what they find important. So cases that we may look at and say, well, this is a hate crime, if the district attorney decides that they don't want to prosecute it as such for whatever reason that they might do so, and there are a lot of them, then you don't see those things. It's a very judgment-oriented business, and what the rest of us see, sometimes the DA or the city attorney might not.
Okay. Thank you. Mark, I want to go back to what you said about the bullying. Is it rooted in any specific ideology? Is it just because I don't like you? I know teenagers go through that phase where they, don't like anybody. Is it based on race or sex or transgender? What's the issue with the bullying?
I think, as Rick said earlier, there's no discrimination in the bullying.
Mm-hmm.
It goes across all levels. It usually comes down to one of power and control and manipulation. Same sex, opposite sex, religious aspects. You see other parts, all parts of it. So a lot of times, though, it will come down to something of a sexual nature.
Mm-hmm.
What happens, between an ex-boyfriend and ex-girlfriend, something of that nature, unfortunately. And that's when the damage is real tough to the other person on the receiving end. Not that it isn't other times, but that's really when it seems to hit home, and those are the ones that get prosecuted.
Okay, thank you. Rick, I want to go back a little bit to some of the symbols of hate that you talked about earlier. In those videos from Charlottesville, and you explain this to our viewers, because some of the things that they saw, I think that most lay people don't really understand. So when those kids were walking and they were saying things like blood and soil, they were using terminology that aren't really common in the modern vernacular. What is the connection between what they're doing now and those terms?
Interesting, because many of these things that they do use especially with the term blood and soil, does have very distinct Nazi connections. Blood and soil is actually a racial term from Germany going back to the late 19th century, but it was picked up on and used extensively by the Nazis in that era. So many of these things have their roots in either Nazism or hardcore white supremacy, and as Neil mentioned earlier, one of the things, there's a common saying that most people are not familiar with, called the 14 words, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. This was a term that was coined by a guy who was doing 120 years for crimes. Basically, they were charged on RICO crimes, but it was for trying to start a race war. And you'll find a lot of things. For example, on some of these websites will have their 14 points. And it won't specifically refer to the 14 words, but yet since they're using the 14, there's a definite connotation there that their points line up with the 14 words, things like that. Or another one will use 88 precepts. Well, 88 is code for the 8th letter of the alphabet, or Heil Hitler. So you find a lot of these little subtleties that unless you really look at this stuff on a regular basis, you won't even know what it is. Or, for example, one of the shields that was used at Charlottesville carried an image of something called the sun wheel, and the sun wheel, this round symbol, it's actually an ancient symbol, but was used by some prominent Nazis during that period. But also in Europe today, the sun wheel is used as a replacement for the swastika, because swastikas are illegal in Germany and not welcome in some of the other German countries. So you see these little things with the symbols, and you almost have to go online and say, well, this one's got these crossed hammers, what does that mean, or what does the sun wheel mean, and so forth. And a lot of the times when you start getting into the minutiae, you'll find that they are very specific racist or white supremacist symbols.
Okay, I appreciate that. I'm just wondering, do these 20-something-year-olds, are they just following, what's thrown at them, or do you think that they've actually done this research and they're fully aware of what they're doing?
It's kind of hard for somebody my age to get in the mind of a 20-year-old, even though I have to attempt it on a regular basis. I think that the hardcore people that we saw in Charlottesville, that were marching, that were carrying the shields, I think the good majority of them do know these things. Yes, there are some who are caught up in it and think it's cool and the like, and maybe don't even understand why they had the shields in the first place, because it's kind of a throwback to the Greek Spartan era, when the 300 Spartans took on the Persian hordes at Thermopylae. And that's the way that these groups see themselves. They are the small number that's fighting the good fight. Yes, there are some of them out there that don't understand these things, but truthfully, I think that many of those principles that you refer to are some of the first things that they learn in the recruitment / radicalization process.
Okay. I would like to open up this time for anyone on our panel. Does the audience have any questions? Anyone? Do you have a question?
I guess I have a comment to make and then a question. After going through Rick's presentation, I think I went through in the morning too, the use of like the old symbols, for example, like the Celtic cross. I think in a way there's a long-term damage to these, like the Celtic culture and like Pippa the Frog was never actually a hate symbol until it was made a hate symbol. And a lot of the even the talk about the Spartans and the Greeks and the Romans, essentially they're kind of using the symbols, essentially kind of just tarnishing history that isn't necessarily meant to be hateful or anything in that context. So in a way, it seems like they're kind of they're kind of killing their own message. Essentially, they're kind of tarnishing their own image of what they're proud of, which is kind of interesting. But I guess my question is more about hate crimes for Mark. I guess, and since you're a criminal defense lawyer, you might have to play kind of devil's advocate. But so how does the state really justify the distinction of hate crimes? I mean, how is it possible for the state to even, because a crime is a crime, right? How does the state then?
Well, it's a great question, but with every potential crime, there's a mental element associated with it. And our system doesn't allow you to look into someone's mind, so you have to look at the totality of the circumstances surrounding that. And I think that's when it comes to, if the threat is a real threat and it's an immediate threat, and the person it's sent to has perceived that, they then have to look at it, well, geez, is that a reasonable response? So the prosecution or the law enforcement look at it and say, is that a reasonable response, how that person perceived that threat? And I think, as the gentleman said, it depending on who's in charge or who's taking the complaint and stuff like that, you may or may not get a charge. But I think the more dialogue that there is and the more views that come forth and different types of views, then the easier it will be to prosecute those types of hate crimes.
And,
I'm
sorry.
Go ahead.
Please, please.
I can't speak specifically to law here in Ohio. I can in California. And some 40-plus states have hate crimes laws. But essentially, and I think they're basically the same, if I walk up to you right now and I slug you in the head, that can be charged as an assault. If I walk up to you and I do the same thing and I slug you and I call you a dirty N-word, then that can be charged as a hate crime. And it's in that regard, there needs to be, when it's a hate crime, there needs to be some element that refers, and again, different states have different laws. California, for example, has a full package: race, religion, gender, ethnicity, and so forth. Some states don't cover gender and choice type things, but most will cover race, religion, ethnicity, and so forth. So a reference to that while committing another crime, such as an assault or graffiti, which is property damage, then that can be charged as a hate crime.
And actually, just to your comment, Andy, before the question, I had a mediation once involving students that put me in mind of what you said. It was a student came to school wearing a swastika necklace. And needless to say, a whole bunch of particularly Jewish kids in the school weren't feeling it, And this was I knew the young kid who was wearing the swastika, so unlike what you might think, lovely kid who was as committed to multiculturalism and tolerance as anyone I ever met. He was of an Indian descent. This was a family heirloom given to him by his grandfather, because for him it was a symbol of prosperity and luck and only good things. And we had to really do quite a lengthy session to make him understand the other side's perspective, because he didn't see Nazis when he looked at it. He saw his grandfather and Hinduism and benevolence and all these values that this kid was a leader of in this school. But he had a hard time accepting what message was also now in that piece, of jewelry. And we were able to mediate it, and the resolution was he didn't wear it externally while he was in school. I mean, he was a nice kid. He understood but he was really pained by the inference that he would espouse something other than what he felt he was espousing, which was positive things, not negative, right? So there is that notion, but at the end of the day, the kids who were hurt by it seem to have a little more authority in that decision versus his right to wear this family heirloom.
And there's a long history of symbols that have been appropriated by movements. One of them you mentioned earlier, the Celtic cross. I think we have a couple of religious leaders here that are probably familiar with the Celtic cross, because it's not exclusively a white supremacy symbol. You find it on Catholic churches. You will find gravestones in Arlington Cemetery with Celtic crosses on them. But unfortunately, that and other symbols are appropriated by extremist movements. And one with the Celtic cross, it's because many of the white supremacy movement rely heavily on the Celtic and the Nordic culture, because they're these Northern European, quote, Aryans, if there is such a thing. So yes, and on the swastika issue, the swastika was only a negative symbol after 1933. I'm sure right here in Columbus there are buildings built before 1933 that have swastikas on them. We have plenty of them in California. I've seen buildings in Iceland with swastikas, that they are historic buildings, and it was not a derogatory symbol before the Nazis appropriated it.
And to go back and answer what you asked also, I do a lot of police recruit training, and I think that that's one of the things I try to teach them, because a lot of times we don't look for bias. And the prosecution of the crime starts with that officer who's there taking that report. So I think it's important for us to try to make it a training issue that when that bias is presented to an officer, he has to make a note of it, so that when it gets to the prosecutor, it follows that chain up, that there's bias involved in this incident. So that's something that we try to stress when we train police recruits. Good question.
And we have been exposed to some jurisdictions where unless the victim says, I feel like this is a hate crime, it won't go any further than that.
Right.
And I really don't think we can expect a victim to have to, A, have the presence of mind, or B, the training and awareness to name that out, right?
Any other? Yes.
Yes, so the question I have is, to what degree do you feel that the browning of America has influenced digital hate, and the lack of cultural understanding contributing, coupled with that? Are you seeing, Rick, from your research, any type of increase in digital hate activity because America is becoming more brown than it was before?
Oh, absolutely. It's had an immense effect on the digital side, because everybody's favorite word these days is dog whistle. Well, when you start using that dog whistle and saying that the white race is disappearing, they used to put this on the hard copy publications 25 years ago. Now, all you have to do is post it on a Twitter feed or something like that, and it gets attention. Because people see on the street, they see right in front of them that, we have more African Americans, or we have more Hispanics in our neighborhood and in our schools and so forth. So they see they see those things posted online, and their mind goes to what they're seeing in real life, and to them it looks like, oh, you know what, it's true, the white race is disappearing, and they buy into these things that that it's some kind of organized program that somebody is trying to do that. I mean, we live in a society, we marry who we want, we have children with who we want, and things happen. That's the way society changes over thousands of years. So absolutely, that has a major increase in the online activity, and once somebody finds a good line to post, what do? They repost it and repost it constantly and get likes and discussion and the like. So absolutely.
And just as a part of the human condition, I think when the status quo fluxes, people react. I mean, people are change resistant. Whether it's positive or negative, it seems to bring out stuff in people. As a routine part of diversity training, I always tend to talk about change with folks, because through the years of doing the complaint process, I heard so much about just the change, not even any specific one, but something changed. It's not normal anymore. It's bad. I don't like it. Whether or not there was an impact, negative or not. So I do think a lot of it is just a vague resistance to change that I got to then tag on to something. So if it's the color piece, the race, the religion, different job or gender roles, whatever it is, it's just not what I'm used to, and I'm uncomfortable with it. So one way, I think, is just to help people become more comfortable with those changes. Back to the training piece. Being given them a platform to say why they're just uncomfortable about it, giving them the voice. May not be any remedy, right? But just allowing them to voice it and admit that there's some insecurity and anxieties, I think, could help lessen their desire to act out against those things.
I agree, Neil, and social media definitely fuels it. When you're able to, you know, belong to a group that thinks like you, believes like you, and you can sing to the choir and you put your message out there and all these, you know, you get this feedback that you're so great and wonderful for what you believe, even though it's racist or sexist or whatever your message is. So I think that definitely fuels the problem. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Given what you know about the damage that digital hate causes, what do you recommend to communities to help reconcile differences or the tension that's out there right now?
It's a difficult question because there's so much of it out there. It's so easy to access, and there's so few of us. I think that we need civic groups, we need religious groups and things to have discussions about this within their own congregations, within their own groups, and we have to start somewhere. So make sure that the members of a congregation or a civic group or so forth are aware of the problem. Maybe they're looking at what their kids are doing. Have a frank discussion about it and make sure that they do know. As a number of people here today have said, you know, the first part of the presentation here opened a lot of eyes. Well, I guarantee you that in most cases the young people have already seen at least some of this type of material somewhere. So the more conversations that we have about it, the more we approach it in as many ways as we can. It's a problem where it looks and in some ways is overwhelming, and it may look like only a little bit what we can do within our own group, but I you know, personally, I give presentations to my local political groups or community groups and so forth, and I talk about this and say, you know, go home and talk to your kids about it. Make sure if they're seeing some of this stuff, they know how to process it and the like. And I think we need to do a lot more of this. So in the case of community groups, in the case of you know, interdenominational meetings and things like this, talk about that in those type of things, so that we spread the message as far as possible.
Great point, great question. And to take it, I'm sorry, just away from the digital aspect, you mentioned two words, tensions and anxiety in the community. And part of the reason I'm here today is through the Bar Association. I got to work on a project. It seems like I've been working on it forever, but, and I don't mean this as a sales pitch, but it's a project that started with the Ohio State Law School. Nancy Rogers, who at one time was an acting attorney general, as well as some staff, started this project. They got a grant, a $500,000 grant, and they started a project called the Divided Communities. What divides our communities? They went out and they interviewed about 150 people. Well, then it evolved that they came to the Columbus Bar Association and some other associations for help. So basically the concept is, it's called the Community Trust Project, and you'll hear about it in the near future in the media and stuff like that. But basically what it tries to do is bring political, religious, social, stakeholders, legal, and city leaders together, not just the leaders, but actually the people in the community who have input and who can address the tensions in the Somalian culture, who can address the tension in the Linden area. And we found out shortly that just in the Linden area itself, there were 8 or 9 leaders, religious leaders, who had a group that answered to them kind of, or had their ear. So it's a situation where it's evolved to, we broke it down into 4 groups. Readiness, so basically if we can bring the groups together in advance and talk about the tensions and talk about the anxieties in the communities, and people hear that, and then you have people, stakeholders who can act upon it, that when there is civil unrest, it will be decreased. Now it started from a model after Ferguson in Baltimore, and an individual from California actually comes to the meetings and helps with the structure of it. But basically it's exactly what you were saying, exactly what you were just saying, the chance for the community individuals to come together in some type of format to air their tensions, to air their anxieties, and have someone hear them and maybe act upon them. The goal, our ultimate goal, is when there is civil unrest, it will be less damaging than in any other aspects, and it brings everyone together and in advance, so to speak, to talk about potential problems, whether they be digital hate, whether they be, you know, religious, whether it be school, whether it be immigration, political, those types of issues. So we will get you an invite so to the specific meetings. Yep.
And again, similar, you know, my real estate friends all say location, 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 right? Dialogue, 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 from my perspective. A lot of the work I deal with is in terms of implicit biases and explicit. The more contact we have, the harder it is to maintain any kind of bias. The more we'll see similarities. But it's not as easy as just putting people in a room. There's a lot of thought that needs to go into it, ways to create safety, ways to continue that conversation. One of the things we're very fond of saying at Diversity Matters is we want to take diversity topics from being an event to being more of a process. It's not something you can do one day a week, one day a year, or one day in your career. It's an ongoing dialogue. It's a relationship. One of my personal pieces, and I talk to groups about this constantly, you know, how do we remove obstacles to those dialogues? And I feel one of the greatest dialogues through the years has been the whole focus on political correctness. Because people are so now paralyzed about, I might say something wrong, they prefer not to speak at all. And then I have to work with groups to understand it's not easy to hear someone say something incorrect about your group or your culture or people you love. But how else will that learning take place? So we can't always jump down somebody's throat for their lack of awareness or sophistication. We need to help them to learn. I'm always very fond of pointing out I wish we spent more time looking for similarity and not as much time looking for difference, which is one of my condemnations of my own field. But we're not going to find those similarities if I get offended and refuse to educate every time somebody says something that they don't understand about my group or my people and what have you. Similarly, I'm also understanding if people are similar than me, then they may not be the quickest learners. And very few of us are patient about repeating those kind of messages. Maybe one time I'll say, look, you know, what you said is really offensive, and here's why. But what if I didn't really absorb it that first time, right? And I don't tend to absorb things on the first time. So I do think we need to work as individuals and as groups at being more patient with one another about having these dialogues and not being as condemning about what we don't know and what we don't understand, and really encouraging that learning to take place. To that end, because, and I think everyone on the panel so far has made the point, we can't be everywhere all the time. My firm, Diversity Matters, has been working very hard this last 2 years, I'll say, on creating an online platform to help do that, so that people can have more information available to them, increase that learning, and even have a place to do those dialogues, perhaps in the safety of their own home, sitting in their jammies, what have you. Also, I'm trying now to work with groups about learning tools that are transferable. Our communities have just become so diverse with ethnicity and interest and hobby and so, I mean, all the typical topics that we can't possibly teach everyone how to deal with everything they're going to see. So we need to learn some skills that no matter what you put in front of me, I now have an ability to introduce that language, that dialogue, to ask the questions I need to find ways that we can be respectful towards one another. That, and reminding folks it's not a one-way dance. And I do think for a lot of years it's been pitted as majority versus minority, what have you. And I don't think inclusion is ever going to work until we acknowledge everybody has an equal access to it. It's not a question of taking away rights and privilege from one group to extend it to another. We need to all share them. It's not a zero sum. And one of my, I'm fond of pointing out is, diversity applies to white guys too, that kind of like, we all benefit, we all need it, we all have investment in it at the end of the day, and we can't exclude anybody from that dialogue, that conversation.
Let's be clear about something too, is change is systemic. Here we are at the police academy. If the current academy class has a diversity class from Diversity Matters that they didn't have 20 years ago, well, 10 years down the line, how are those guys going to react that had that class? And 15 years or 10 years, 12 years down the line, when a couple of those guys are now officers and have to worry about other guys and what they're doing. The same thing goes for kids. If I talk to a group of young people now and I talk about these issues of online bigotry and so forth, you know, it may not make as much sense to them when they're 15, but what about 10 years from now when all of a sudden they're married and having kids of their own, and they have to, who knows what their kids are going to grow up with, and you know, they're probably, their online stuff is probably going to be on their skin. Who knows? So, but we have to plant seeds that then have to grow.
Thank you, panel. I appreciate your lively discussion. I think that we've all been enlightened and learned some great things. Would any of you like to make any closing remarks? Okay, at this time, I'd like to introduce the founder of Diversity Matters, LLC, Mr. Ron Kaur.
There you go. Thank you. It's the start of our conversation series. We want to continue this dialogue. I think there's a lot of wonderful information we actually offer today, and there's a lot more that we want to offer and help continue doing, from the BAR programs to other programs that we have here. I think one of the challenges that we always recognize when we've been training at the police department here is that they typically receive about 16 hours of training as a recruit class. They don't get continually diversity and inclusion training throughout their careers. I think the need of investment for more training throughout the livelihood of the first responder is clearly something that we should be discussing and trying to bring forth about. And then kind of just continuing the conversation. How can we just continue to really ferment our ideas and kind of complement to each other's and really kind of learn about each other and really kind of grow as a city and a community. And let's start planning our next kind of conversation with you. Thank you.